Hello again. Glad you're able to make it back. Again, this is the long form series of how to defend the Bible, or some suggestions in defending the Bible. This should be taken in conjunction with again, something I think is a very, very valuable tool for interacting with skeptics and non-believers, and that would be the Greg Koukl's book, Tactics. How to use questions and investigation to get clear on where people are when you talk to them about these real eternal issues, or even defending why you think it's an eternal issue versus not. So we're getting into session 4. We're going to get into some more of the specifics, especially dealing with what we would call type A objections. That would be the eccentricities and odd things in the Bible that are brought up and usually presented in a meme format or in a bumper sticker or something like this to in today's extremely adversarial environment is intended to be creative and snarky and a challenge to biblical authority and anybody that treats it as a biblical authority. So this is session 4, where we get into type A objections, the eccentricities, the weirdness, the odd passages in the Bible that are mined, pulled out of context, not studied or understood very well. And since they're not preached upon and talked about very much because they require contextual explanation, setup, and runway off landing, they tend to be, again, exaggerated as the very type of thing you find all across the Bible. And therefore, the Bible should not be ever thought of as an authority in any sort of sense, a legal sense, a moral sense, in the sense of a personal authority and instruction in any category, because, I mean, again, you don't understand it the way you should, or if you did, what do you do with these passages, or there's a reason you guys avoid these. So we're going to look at these today and start with these memes here. This is an example here, again, of an extreme position expressed in a very quick, pithy meme format. That word coined by Richard Dawkins as a mind communication, or something passed from one mind to another. I guess you'd need the sociology of religion and the sociology of ideas there to underwrite the whole problematic concept of a meme sounding like a gene, which is passed biologically. But a meme passes in other ways, and it's ideological, it's mental. But yes, so here you see two memes with regard to unicorns. Isaiah 34:7, and the unicorn shall come down with them, and their land shall be soaked with blood, and their dust made fat with fatness. Again, this other meme, unicorns are mentioned 9 times in the Bible. Cats are mentioned 0. That's all you need to know about the Bible. And you see the unicorn there with the cat and the gun on the back, and the cat with a headband. Look like he's ready to go into battle. So again, what's going on here? The whole idea is to really ridicule those who would attend a youth group, those that would go and be a part of any Bible study or treat the Bible in any sort of seriousness. Because after all, you've got a book that, notice this pushes into the mythology, a type B category push as well. That, look, they've got this in the Bible, therefore you should reject it. So we're going to look at these passages and look to see why modern translations don't use unicorn, and it's not because they're afraid of what the word means. We'll look at it here. So again, memes intended to embarrass, type A memes that are supposed to show a sheer strangeness of the expression in the ancient world, as well as push it into the type B category of mythology, superstition. So the Bible has unicorns in the text. The Bible has unicorns in the text? That's really quite odd. So then people ask the question, like high schoolers have asked me this: does the Bible require us to believe in unicorns? The answer is emphatically no. But here are some of the passages we're talking about in the King James Version. God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. Numbers 23:22. And notice here this meme, because the Bible tells me so, the passages where unicorns were used in certain translations. And the unicorn shall come down with them. That's the Isaiah passage we just looked at. So what's going on here? One, you're not required to believe in unicorns if you come to the Bible. But let's look at, again, it wouldn't take long, a word study of the Hebrew, which would be the relevant original language in which this took place and the time frame in which this took place. Again, makes for a funny meme. But remember, the memes are a serviceable way to embarrass the believer into at least not talking about their allegiance to the Bible or discussing it. Because wait a second, what? So I can tell you this: there's nobody in churches or at Christian schools or Christians that are in the academy or authoring books amongst the brilliant genius level people that are theists and Christian theists. They're not setting about defending the existence of unicorns, even as some being that a beast that might have gone extinct in the past or in prehistory. But let's look at this and give it a look here. Wild ox or rhinoceros is a more accurate translation of the Hebrew word rahim. Rahim. In one of the books we are using in this section, Dan Kimball's How Not to Read the Bible, he talks about meeting a barber once cutting his hair that saw a meme on his phone that said, if you believe in the Bible, you must believe in unicorns. And, he laughed about it, and it made him feel really good about the fact that he didn't spend a lot of time in church or read the Bible. And this is the first time Dan Kimball, who is a pastor and now is going to actually train leaders and how to do this, is moving over into training leaders at Christian university and at seminaries now had heard this sort of thing. Again, wild ox or rhinoceros is used in nearly any other translation but the old King James, now even the new King James. But again, I've seen this as well. I saw somebody had a bumper sticker at the Florida Gulf Coast University that said, "Fact, unicorns existed in the Bible," and an image of a unicorn with a quote from Isaiah 34. Okay, so again, so you can still find the word unicorn in the King James because this was the year it was translated, was 1611. So they thought this might be, even though it wasn't an existent being, it might be a reference to a non-existent being that might have gone extinct. And here's why. In the ancient Babylonian literature that's been unearthed relatively recently, over the last 200 years, there was an extinct bull with a powerful horn that wasn't exactly like a rhinoceros, but had a prominent horn called the Rimu, or the Auroch, said by the Assyrians. The Babylonians called it Rimu, the Assyrians called it Auroch. But there's significant descriptions of an agrarian animal that was both wild and tame, that had a singular prominent horn, or a prominent horn with a very, very small nub of a horn, that existed in the ancient world, that was a powerful quadruped. So again, this was something that was in the ancient world. And though there were accounts of this sort of thing, and again, by these aren't mythical accounts, the Auroch and the Rimu, though some of these accounts do have supernatural elements in them. They have a lot of historic elements as well, or historically verifiable elements as well. So again, the word is rahim. It doesn't necessarily mean unicorn. That's why, again, wild ox, that was probably this Auroch or Rimu, or rhinoceros fits better in the context there. So again, these passages that say unicorn are only in the King James Version, primarily because even in 1611 there was a thought that maybe there was a being like this. It's not out of the ordinary to think of a quadruped with horns. That's not something that was beyond the ken of the scholars of the King James Version of the Bible. But now we have bona fide historic evidence of an extinct being that had at least a prominent singular horn, or a singular horn singularly without a second horn, a symmetrical horn on the other side. So that's why modern translations move there, and that's probably why the King James said this might be best interpreted as unicorn. This is one of my favorite. I sprinkle a lot of funny memes to go against these sort of memes that are done by the Babylon Bee here. Man who doesn't read the Bible, also chief authority on what Jesus would do and say today. This would also be a person who doesn't read the Bible is the chief authority on what this word rahim must mean. Unicorn, and that means you're an idiot for believing it, and it's filled with mythical beings like unicorns and talking. Another way of doing this is when people say, well, all you need to know about the Bible is that it has a talking serpent at the beginning and a dragon at the end. Genesis, Revelation. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get there. But again, that's just a way to take a biblically illiterate person and try to, again, push the Bible into the mythological category, and therefore you're as foolish to use this as a guidebook for morality or law or building societies, social instruction, as somebody would be using Aesop's fables or a modern fiction as well. So let's look again at some of these more extreme. Again, these are category type A, odd and eccentric, non-modern examples. The Bible bans football. Again, popular online YouTube videos, blogs, titles like 13 Weird Things the Bible Bans You May Not Know About, 11 Things the Bible Bans You Do Anyway, 7 Shocking Bible Verses You Won't Hear in Church. Usually these come down to couple things. Some of the more hard to understand Levitical laws, right? Like bans on pork and shrimp, bans on mixing fabrics, bans on mixing certain types of plants, certain types of haircuts and beards, tattoos. So they say this so that it looks like either the Bible is a capricious series, a pointless, arbitrary series of commands that none of us would take seriously today, or they're immoral in the sense that they're majoring on the minors, right? So, but the Bible bans football in particular is really funny because that's back to that thing written by the West Wing writers for Bartlett in our last session. They were talking about, well, should we tell the Washington Redskins, now called the Washington Colonials, Capitals, I can't remember, whatever politically correct term instead of Redskins that was supposed to be a positive compliment to Redskins. But anyway, that the Bible bans football because it's a pigskin. You can't handle pigs, right? You can't eat them either. So therefore, Bartlett says, should they be killed for that? Should they wear the leather gloves as well, even though leather gloves aren't made of pigskin? And if they're not wearing gloves, anyway, should we stop Sunday football? Just a really poor critique of the Bible and somebody who takes the Bible seriously, but put in the mouth of a brilliant Democratic liberal president. The Bible bans bacon and seafood. The Bible bans planting 2 different types of plants together. Professional football player, Leviticus 11:8, right? Bible bans football because he's handling a pigskin. How in the world can Tim Tebow take a knee? This is ridiculous. This also gets cashed out. Does God say tattoos are wrong, or getting a bowl cut Beatles-like haircut? Again, even if you're tempted to shrug aside the Bible's ban on like tattoos, haircut styles, eating shrimp, it's more difficult to ignore something more like slavery. So we'll talk about that a little later. We'll give quite a considerable amount of space to that later. But yeah, so, again, Bible passages that approve of things like slavery, polygamy, killing birds to cure mold, some of the more bloody sacrificial rituals, extreme violence, this sort of thing. We'll get to those for sure later. But the message is fairly clear here. The Bible's foolish. It's primitive. It's disturbing. You should never, ever take it seriously. So again, people wonder about what the Bible says is off limits, and they have questions about what the Bible says is off limits, and are asking these sort of things today. And it's illegitimate to ask for these things to be handled from the pulpit on a Sunday. Now, again, maybe you do a series or do a superficial engagement of these sort of things, but the idea that you're going to, again, get this sort of thing going on is really, really interesting. So here's where you find in Deuteronomy 22, do not plant 2 kinds of seed in your vineyard. Not only the crops you plant, but also the fruit of the vineyard will be defiled. Do not plow with an ox and a donkey yoked together. Do not wear clothes of wool and linen woven together. Make tassels on the 4 corners of the cloaks you wear. So, another way of playing this, I can remember a student years ago in a Q&A said this very thing to me. Hold on, let me get a sip here. Said, you don't have tassels on your clothes, so I know you don't really take the Bible seriously. Another thing that was said to me by a student after I taught a session at a Christian college was, Dr. Joe, I'm not trying to be a gotcha here. Actually, I wouldn't have said Dr. Joe at the time because I didn't have my doctorate, so I think it's Mulv. Just call me Mulv. I was, again, teaching with my master's. and he said, filling in for another professor as a guest lecturer. And he was actually a guy in my dorm, not my dorm, my apartment complex. It was like a dormitory. He's one of my residents, Michael Gathright. Anyway, is that okay for me to say that? Anyway, he's still a believer. I think he's all right. Anyway, this guy came to me after one of my sessions, and one of the ways I ended my my lesson was I said, well, I'd rather at the end of time and when we're standing face to face with after our lives are over, I'd rather say, oh, you didn't mean that literally, and I took it literally and obeyed it anyway when it comes to the Bible, versus, oh, you meant that literally, and I didn't take it seriously and didn't do it literally. In other words, I wasn't defending fundamentalism, but I was saying we should rather have that approach to it. Let's try to do as best we can, apply as best we can, than throw it out of hand. And because we're already prone as fallen, rebellious human beings to not wanting to do this and not wanting to submit to a higher authority. He came to me later, actually, when we were at the rec center later, and said, here's the problem. Even if you just go New Testament, your wife spoke in church last week, 1 Corinthians, and she wasn't wearing a head covering last week. Now, at the time, I just said, well, I just have to throw myself on the mercy of Jesus. I don't literally apply those things there that are found in the corpus of Paul's writings about ecclesiology, church praxis. I now have a more nuanced and I think understandable answer to that sort of thing. We can talk about it later. We can talk about it now, which is this. We'll talk about we will talk about this a little bit later. Every ethics course you'll ever take will have both two levels of ethics: the timeless moral principle and the application. The application can take a number of forms, depending on the differences in language and culture and time frame. That doesn't make morality relative. It just means in application, there's going to be different expressions of it amongst human beings. But that doesn't remove the timeless moral principle. So, for example, when it comes to being silent, there's a specific silence that's being referenced there with regard to church interaction and leadership versus participant in church there in 1 Corinthians. Also, the general principle is still there, even if the specific isn't there. I mean, I can remember people making the claim that, especially with head coverings, when your head was uncovered, it expressed something very specific in the Corinthian context, and you were approached and spoken to by a woman in a worship setting. It usually meant you were being propositioned by a temple prostitute. They were unmarried, uncovered head, and now speaking to you to consummate your worship experience on the hill to the goddess Aphrodite there on the hill in Corinth, in that port city, to consummate and take a financial remuneration for your sexual contact with the temple prostitute. That is no longer the case. When a woman speaks in church, we don't think prostitute. Does that make it culturally relative there? No. The timeless moral principle is still there. The application may have changed, but it's still there, which is just this: don't speak out of turn in church. Don't let your appearance and your verbiage distract from what God's doing, whether it be a sexual distraction or a verbal distraction from what's going on. So again, it certainly doesn't mean it's not a universal prohibition anyway. But at the time, I just said I throw myself on the mercy of Jesus and say I'm not applying that the way I should, and say that this is probably not a damnable sin. But and not to abuse grace, but I didn't really know how to work that out with regard to those New Testament expressions. And by the way, there's some probably the best book on application of moral codes and doctrine, Christianity, is the two books by Daniel Doriani, Getting to the Truth and Getting the Message Right. Really, really good Bible scholar, Daniel Doriani. Outstanding. I'll probably do videos with Daniel Doriani stuff in the future, or at least suggest it to you. So anyway, here's the idea that, again, if you're going to do these sort of things, these are more, again, just look how stupid or how silly your Bible is. So let's talk a little bit about these. First, remember, at the fall of humankind, sin infects the world, and now you have, and this is something that helped Kimball in seminary understand this sort of thing, you have something like a nuclear bomb falling and spiritually infecting and having a fallout effect all the way until the new heavens and the new earth, but where you get an infusion of new grace and new power with the coming and the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus and the new covenant. But you now have God working in a fallen, sinful, sin-infested environment where general revelation mixes with free will and sovereignty, and common grace, as well as special revelation and special grace. That sort of specified grace of God and faith. So sin infecting the world. In other words, you're going to have this sinful environment where people are coming to the wrong conclusions, maybe the right general conclusions. There's a supernatural realm. You're a mind-body hybrid or a soul-body hybrid. There's a supernatural realm. There's a higher power, or powers plural, and then all sorts of illegitimate sinful applications of this sort of thing as well. And we're not talking about morality anymore and the timeless moral truth in the application. We'll get to more of that later and more examples of that later. But here you have sin infecting the world and then having the fallout here in this diagram. So the fall, sin, and you can see there the symbols of danger with nuke fallout, the fallout from the rebellion of our first father and mother and Adam and Eve. And then again, God, the Trinitarian Father, there all through eternity. But you have these acts in the Bible where you have these sort of things. And again, so God is working within a compromised context here, a sinful compromised context. So it's important to keep that in mind when it comes to sort of these things. But let's talk about a couple of these for you in this session very, very quickly. Again, one of the practical bans on pork or shrimp is that it's the highest risk meat out there, the highest risk meat out there. But there's probably a more, and why is that important? Well, if you're in a pre-modern era and you're going to take the riskiest meat that has the highest chance of infection, because pigs don't sweat and they tend to be eat trash and eat fecal matter, then you have a high chance of that God's covenant people eating a compromised meat there. That just isn't the same case with modern heating technology now. Today, it's still an unhealthy meat. It's just not as deadly as it was during that covenant time period of the Exodus and into Canaan. Probably a more significant critique is this. Pagans used live and dead pigs for worship of their netherworld or underworld gods in religious ritual. And again, these were sacrifices and a worship of these animals because of the continuity. We've talked about this in the Myth versus the Bible in the Old Testament, using the great John Oswalt's book, The Bible Amongst the Myths, that they were used in a myriad of ways to show your allegiance to dead, non-existent idols or demons animating someone's imagination to think these idols were real in the spiritual realm or in the not quite empirical realm. So though connected to it. So netherworld gods, ritual pigs were used in that way. So not only are they unhealthy, they were used specifically in pagan religious ritual to manipulate through sacrifice or worship the underworld gods, the gods that were sometimes animating the baser parts of human existence, where people would take advantage of other image bearers of God. The skeptical American football application is absolutely absurd. No football exterior was ever made of pigskin. The nickname pigskin was based on the interior until the 1890s. So it's now all footballs are synthetic anyway. I know many of them aren't even leather with regard to cowskin. But the idea that football has to stop, or isn't it absurd, they're handling an actual pigskin and therefore they're violating the Bible by playing football, is really stupid. Quite frankly, it's insulting to say it's sophomoric because it insults sophomores, as the great Alvin Plantinga used to say. So ceremonial and purity ban laws to Exodus era Jews are no longer applicable to us now. So ceremonial and purity laws seem to be fulfilled, or in some way significantly fulfilled, so that they're abrogated, not in a Muslim way, but in a very in covenant fashion, right? So again, pigskin, the bladder of a pig or another animal is inflated to use in the inner part of the ball. Again, that the pig bladders were stopped. They stopped using those in the late 1800s, and again, only cowhide and various synthetics are used now. So again, so I don't. Even if it were true that the the pig skin was used with a football, it would not be a biblical argument against football or against us even taking the pork ban seriously, especially given that the New Testament calls all food clean and says that now that this is not. That's why I said it's more important the religious rather than the health component. The health component is important. That, in other words, there's an underlying general revelation logic to avoiding pig meat in this time in human history and in the development of tech at the time, in the 14th and 15th century BC. So again, the more important thing was these pigs were symbolically, metaphorically, icons of your disdain for Jehovah and Yahweh. You're using them transparently to manipulate and get bloodthirsty, powerful gods of the netherworld that weren't even authentic deities on your side, to give you a leg up, an advantage in this world. So again, you can see the meme here. God hates shrimp and he hates football too. Yeah. Something to do as we close down this section, or to look at as we close down this section, is the Bible's a library written for us, not to us. Now, again, this really strikes Pentecostals as negative. It doesn't mean the Bible can't be applied to us, but remember, again, context. This is not to get rid of these commands so that we can live however we want or defy God or soften, because we're just weak-kneed morally now and we don't want to do this anymore and we're trying to put a thin veneer on our rebellion. No, we're saying, look, the Bible is written to other people. It's for us to look at and to understand and to see how God's speaking to us through it, but it's not specifically written to us today. So some of the things that you see in the Bible aren't specific commands to us. And that brings us to a really two big principles here that are very, very important in discussion with somebody after you've handled some of the smaller minutia of some of their specific consistency argument, type A or type B arguments here. And it's this. The Bible, because it's a historic text, it is a historical text. That means real people in real places in real time, and their interactions with God and the Bible functioning as a tiebreaker between the speculations about higher power that the other communities and cultures came to, and why I believe the Jews were truly the chosen people of the singular monotheistic deity versus the polytheistic approach to understanding the supernatural and the heavenly realm. But the Bible is historically grounded as an account of God acting amongst a certain people in a certain place and a certain time, and then incarnating as the culmination of those 66 books as the best and most incredible expression of who he is. So the Bible contains descriptive and prescriptive elements. That means things we are commanded to do and should do one-to-one, and descriptive, what we shouldn't necessarily do, but is describing something taking place. One of the classic examples I use in class in this is David. We are to trust God in the face of being led by him to challenge someone against all odds and the dependence upon him for a miracle. Absolutely. Trust him in our low times and our high times to make sure we're humble and deferential when all sorts of accolades come our way. And then we're also not prone to suicidal despair when hard times come as well, but that we would trust him through that and see through the despair and the hardship to hope. That's a great Davidic something, a prescription, right? Just like a doctor prescribes a medication to you. But we're not supposed to follow the description of David's leaving of those sort of things in his calling upon Bathsheba, murder of Uriah, and then his terrible example as a father toward the end of his life as the apex king in the monarchy. You get Saul, and you get an arc and a fall. You get David, an arc and a fall, and Solomon, an arc and a fall. Not because that's mythology and good storytelling, but because that's human life, and that's how the Bible presents its characters, which is another astoundingly positive reason to take it very seriously, is the characters are presented in all their earthly foibles. And there's a ton of embarrassing details, and that's, again, a strong indicator of something being historic rather than just propaganda or mythological or legendary. So the other principle is never read a verse alone, never read it in isolation. So key questions to ask: to whom were these laws written, and when were these laws required? So again, Yeah. So if you never encounter a time where you you need to make a treaty with somebody based on land, that could be, again, that could be, you could take the moral principle and apply it to contracts today, but that was something specifically for the Hebrews entering the land of Canaan. So it's really, again, difficult sometimes ferreting out prescriptive versus descriptive, but not that difficult. So there's times where we're instructed to look at the description here, and it is a prescribed something that God wants us to do, an example he wants us to follow, a positive outcome where God is pleased, right? But then because the Bible's historic, it also includes the bad and the ugly as well, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I'm a huge Eastwood fan. Anyway, you might see a statue that's not a toy of him around here very, very soon from one of his iconic movies. Anyway, the point here is this: descriptive, prescriptive. And why is this a big cash value for someone who's encountering a consistency argument? You eat bacon, you eat shrimp, you like football, you mix fabrics, therefore you're not really biblical. Here's why. The Bible has built into it inconsistency. Right here. The very nature of one of the strongest features of our holy book is it is so strongly historically verified. That means the historic accounts around the supernatural events that you have a very difficult time affirming historically. Why is archaeology such a strong friend of the Bible? Means that there are going to be, by definition, prescriptive and descriptive, because it's a true account of human beings that are both with God and act against God, a mix of virtue and vice. Therefore, the Bible you will have inconsistency. In other words, somebody could say this. Think about it. Forget shrimp and pork for a moment, and the response we gave to that pitiful reverse apologetic or skeptical attack. And they said this: you're not very consistent to the Bible. I see you looking into God's word and letting it speak to you. I see you doing all sorts of things that require courage and saying the Holy Spirit helped you do that, but I don't see you killing your friends and taking their wives. David did that. Do you see the point? In other words, one of the ways you qualify the consistency argument is say the nature of our holy book requires some picking and choosing. By definition, there's some things that are descriptive that we're not supposed to emulate. There's some things that are prescriptive that we are to emulate. And those are generally fairly clear in the Bible. You get God being pleased, good outcomes in the things that are prescriptive, and negative in the descriptive. And by the way, that inclusion of that negative is part of you having a holy book that is historically verified and realistic and happening amongst people and not legendary and not mythic. And it's a strong reason to take the Bible seriously, because the historical verification around these things brings more plausibility and believability to the idea of the supernatural that happens. Last slide. At the time of Exodus, pagan, dangerous idol worshipers, what do I mean by dangerous? It's just what they choose, right? Well, no. Religion meant a lot more back then. That means people were going to be taken advantage of. Think Canaanites and sacrificing their children, or Aztecs sacrificing virgins and captured slaves as well, and cannibalizing them. Pagan, dangerous, doesn't mean all idol worshipers are like that, but pagan, dangerous idol worshipers mixed fabrics for the clothes of their holy men or leaders. Pagan, dangerous idol worshipers mix seeds to produce more fertile crops revealed by their gods and for their gods. And pagan, dangerous idol worshipers engage in fertility rituals like temple prostitution or ritual orgy to false gods that included mixing. In other words, crossing distinct types was a part of their worship. The people of Israel were to be holy, set apart in loyalty to God. Set apart in loyalty to God. So the point here is that there was a lot more going on than some arbitrary something with pigs and pig skins and shrimp and haircuts and beards and clothing. And so these were, again, mixing distinct types for a religious purpose to manipulate the pagan gods in your favor, and even sometimes mixing what you should be happy about, mixing a new, fresh glimpse of life like a baby, but sacrificing it in the fire in the arms of the statue Molech so that god, that false god, would give you what you wanted. Molech was mixing. What is it? What do we mean? Mixing death with new life, right? Was mixing something you should be protecting and holding close with something you just give away because you're showing this valuable thing, you're giving it to the god to manipulate the god, allegedly, in pagan thinking. So again, there's a lot more going on than meets the eye here. And you see this here. Sorry, another Babylon Bee. Dozens of Bible verses come forward to accuse Joel Osteen of abuse. Joel Osteen warns it's far too soon to reopen the Bible after COVID-19 and the pandemic, quote unquote. Sorry, there was something there, but again, massively overblown and weaponized by media and everybody else involved. We'll get to the super eccentric next time. But all that to say, let's close it down this time and just say, remember, certain principles apply here, even whether we get into the specifics or not, but these are generally to remember when it comes to dealing with some. There's an answer to these things. These aren't things that are devastating to biblical fidelity, biblical use, or biblical authority. They're quite superficial, flimsy, and honestly, sophomore. I don't want to say sophomoric, but unsophisticated. We'll just say that, not to throw anybody under the bus. But remember, some selection or cherry picking is going to be required by the very nature of what our holy book is, and that it's unique and that it's historical. It's extremely grounded in the history of the ancient world. Jesus was a real person. I know there's some that would deny that, very few that would deny that, but Jesus was a real person. So was Moses. So was Joshua. So were likely the minor prophets like Habakkuk and Nahum. So remember so to the inconsistency argument, there's that. And then there's specific answers to some of these things, that there's a lot more going on there than just some weird eccentric something that we don't pay attention to today. In other words, there's a lot of things in covenant that were for that time period. That doesn't make the Bible relativistic. It means we're no longer to apply those in the same way, because they were to the Israelites during that time in history and during that phase in God's disclosure or expression. And there are certain deep wisdom attached to these things, even though they're no longer required of a new covenant Christian. The ones that are required are fairly clear. But even in that case, the Bible includes within the very nature of God's disclosure of this type in the historical context, that's a really strong bolstering of the fact that you have a revelation that's at least falsifiable if it's going to say supernatural claims that are harder to capture historically and get evidence for historically, either in the ground or in descriptive prose language, epigraphical data, then it's built into it. And never read a Bible verse without context. Read the context and then try to understand the context. That's why the Bible, it tells you to study it. Not just because it's like, pay attention to my book because it's my book. It's study it so that, especially if you're going to be a leader and try to apply these doctrines and concepts, and so that you understand them, even the ones that we bypass either intentionally, unintentionally, or for good reason, but understanding what that meant. We'll talk a little bit more about why these eccentric passages made perfect sense to the people that were originally hearing them, and can, by way of principle, maybe not application, by principle, be carried over as well. Talk to you next time.